Hi, everybody. My name is Brad Kelly, and I'm the regional coordinator for the Society of Biblical Literature's Pacific Coast region. And I want to welcome you to this installment of this year's SBL Pacific Coast Regional Meeting that we're calling K-Ray and Kativ, Read and Written. Obviously, things are a little different with the pandemic this year, so some of the papers are coming to you as video recordings, and I'm excited about this paper today. We have a paper by Rebekah from Claremont Graduate University. This paper comes from our Hebrew Bible program unit at the regional meeting. And so the format is the paper will be for 20 minutes. And then after that, one of the co-chairs of our Hebrew Bible unit, Dr. Carly Crouch, will come on and interact a little bit with our presenter to wrap things up. So without further delay, let me turn it over to Rebekah Call. The title of her paper is Conceptualizations of Nakedness in the Eden Narratives of the Hebrew Bible and the Qur'an. Rebekah.
Thank you. I'll just start by sharing my screen. There we go. Okay. All right. One moment. My iPad screen is frozen. Just a second.
One.
The comparative method is an emerging approach toward scriptural analysis. It can provide not only insight into similarities and differences in traditions, but can also provide understanding into how the conceptions of religious texts have changed over time, and even highlight areas of distinction that modern scholarship has missed. This study will use the comparative method to examine the conceptualization of nakedness in the creation narratives in the Qur'an and the Hebrew Bible. In doing so, this paper will argue that the two corpora use philologically opposing words for nakedness in this context, and that comparative analysis highlights a wide range of questions that have not been examined by modern scholarship, touching on areas such as theology, modesty, gender norms, and textual analysis. The majority of the book of Genesis is written in narrative rather than poetic form. This works well with the sections of the Quran regarding the Garden of Eden. Unlike the majority of the Quran, which is primarily composed of didactic sayings, the portion regarding Adam and Eve's nakedness in Eden is narrative. In addition, scholarship has established that Muhammad wrote many Quranic passages in response to Jewish and Christian teachings. The Garden of Eden narrative in the Quran appears to be one of the passages that most overtly draws from the surrounding Jewish and Christian culture. The narrative presentation and its obvious reference to Genesis make this passage a very fruitful text for comparison with the Hebrew Bible. As the comparative method is only valuable insofar as it does not overgeneralize similarities, this paper aims to avoid useless generalization by examining the intricacies of the Hebrew and the Arabic languages, and to thereby discover more avenues for potential research in each field. In the Hebrew Bible recounting of the Garden of Eden, and I'm going to, in the Hebrew Bible recounting of the Garden of Eden, the word naked, translated from the Hebrew arum, which is from the root ayin, resh, mem, occurs 4 times. Immediately following the creation of Eve, the text comments, and the two of them, the man and his wife, were arum, and were not ashamed in front of each other. The narration continues, detailing how the crafty serpent tricked the woman and the man into eating the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. After partaking of the fruit, the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were arum. And they sewed fig leaves and made for themselves girdles. Afterwards, as God walked about in the garden, Adam and Eve hid. And Yahweh Elohim, which is God, called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" And he said, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I myself am arum, and I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you are arum? Did you eat from the tree that I commanded you not to eat from?" This narrative serves as the foundation for Jewish, Christian, and Muslim understanding of the primordial man and woman. Now, in the Quran, the term translated as naked in the Quran narrative comes from the Arabic term sawa'at from the root letters sin, waw, aleph, and appears 5 times in the context of Eden in the Quran. Following a conversation between Iblis, which is the adversary, and God, in which Iblis promises to try to destroy mankind, the story picks up as follows. Then began Satan, or Iblis, to whisper suggestions to them in order to reveal to them their sawa'at that was hidden from them. So by deceit he brought about their fall. When they tasted of the tree, their sawa'at became manifest to them, and they began to sew together the leaves of the garden over their bodies. Surah 20 gives an alternate retelling. They both ate of the tree, and so their sawa'at appeared to them. They began to sew together for their covering leaves from the garden. Returning to Surah 7, Adam and Eve realize their mistake when God comes to the garden and teaches them and their descendants. O ye children of Adam, we have bestowed raiment upon you to cover your sawa'at. Let not Satan seduce you in the same manner as he got your parents out of the garden, stripping of them of their raiment to expose their sawa'at. We see here several similar points in the narrative. Among other parallels are an adversary, which the serpent or Iblis, manipulating the situation, a dawning awareness of nakedness, the sewing of leaves for a covering, and the deity's response to Adam and Eve's awareness of nakedness. However, while both narratives deal with shame resulting from the exposure of nakedness, without understanding the broader contextual usage of terms regarding nakedness, it can be difficult to judge commentators' ventures into moral questions concerning nakedness. So now we'll turn to commentaries, and we'll begin with the Hebrew Bible. Scholarly commentary regarding nakedness in the Genesis account focuses on several main themes. Gerhard von Rad views nakedness in Eden as something feared and innately tied to sexuality, and as such is the sign of a disruption, the loss of a freedom appointed by God. In a similar vein, Skinner treats nakedness as an excuse for fear. However, he simultaneously pushes back against any sort of sexual implication, such as von Rad espouses. For his part, Davidson scarcely considers nakedness or shame, focusing his comments almost exclusively on the struggle in the mind of the woman and the desire for knowledge that makes the fruit of the tree the desire for knowledge that makes the fruit of the tree of knowledge so alluring. His comments on nakedness tie into this as he identifies awareness of nakedness as the loss of innocence. However, in doing so, he focuses on knowledge to the exclusion of any real discussion surrounding nakedness. Similarly, Wavter centers his discussion of nakedness around innocence and not being ashamed of nakedness, and maturity, which he defines as being ashamed of nakedness. Each of these scholars examines the Eden account as an isolated narrative and do not tie it into the Hebrew Bible as a whole. While it is true that the Hebrew Bible was compiled by multiple authors over an extended period of time, that does not mean that later authors were unaware of what prior authors had written. Rather, the parallel contextual usage of both thematic and verbal elements indicates that authors were in conversation with other texts. In particular, other texts function in conversation with the 5 books of Moses, or the Torah, which serve as the foundation of Jewish mythology, identity, and law. The first of these books is the book of Genesis. In this vein, there is one scholar who does make an attempt to tie the narrative into that of the entire Hebrew Bible, which is Howard Wallace. He argues that Adam and Eve's nakedness is not sexual, even though the idea of nakedness in the Old Testament, according to him, is associated with shame and degradation. Wallace then provides a list of cross-references that support his argument, about 12 verses, and writes that many of these passages are connected with harlotry or the description of idolatry as harlotry. He indicates that in the present narrative, there is a reversal of moral and social norms regarding nakedness centered around an act of disobedience. He goes on to say that the sin itself does not directly involve the naked state of the couple. So Wallace makes very large claims here and appears to provide contextual support for these claims. And these claims will be evaluated later on in the philological portion of this paper. Now we will turn to the Quranic commentators who have provided a lively discussion regarding Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, beginning from the early days of Islam. In his commentary on the Quran, Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn Jarir al-Tabari from the late 800s CE focused his discussion on the sinister intent of Iblis, the adversary, to reveal to them their sawa'at, or nakedness, by tearing off their garments, giving the reader a rather literal reading of the text. In contrast, Yusuf Ali, from the 19th to 20th centuries, takes the concept of nakedness figuratively. The soul in its naked purity and beauty knew no shame because it knew no guilt. The best clothing and ornament we could have comes from righteousness. Syed Hossein Nasr's study Quran from 2005 echoes both earlier commentaries. He references an early narrative of primordial garb of light that covered Adam and Eve's private parts, the loss of which garb not only exposed their genitals, but also figuratively suggests their loss of innocence and evokes a profound sense of alienation. In addition, Nasr goes on to identify from root meaning something bad or evil, and interprets this as meaning that exposing nakedness is inherently sinful and corrupting for human beings outside of contexts such as marriage. We thus find parallels occurring within these commentaries. There is an overlap in the discussions regarding innocence, separation from God, and the loss of the primordial order of God's creation. Both discuss evil and sin, although Hebrew Bible exegetes seem preoccupied with proving or disproving the sexual nature of the narrative, while Quranic discussion focuses on inherent evil without extensive treatment of sexuality. Only Wallace and Nasr make any attempts at philological analysis of sawa'at or arum, and none make a comparative study of the terms across corpora. Now we'll move into the philological examination, beginning with the Hebrew Bible. Taking a closer look at the contexts in which the Hebrew word arum, naked, appears may cast further light on the usage of this word. The root occurs 26 times in the entire Hebrew Bible, of which 4 are in the Garden of Eden narrative. Of the remaining 22 instances, 10 are used in negative context, most commonly exile or the figurative state of Jerusalem after exile. However, while the text earnestly tries to encourage the children of Israel to repent and thereby avoid exile, the state of being in captivity is not inherently sinful. None of these negative contexts depict arum as having any innate sinful or negative moral implication. Rather, they paint arum as it being an undesirable state of being and one that can be avoided. In this sense, these 10 instances are morally neutral. The remaining 12 instances are neutral both morally and contextually. For example, people are born arum and will be arum again when they die. Prophets can be arum when they prophesy. The lack of moral judgment implicit in the word is significant, particularly considering that there is a different word that could have been used instead, namely erva, which is also translated into English as naked. Erva occurs 40 times in the Hebrew Bible. In contrast with arum, it is only used once neutrally in an instruction for the sons of Aaron to make clothing to cover their erva. The remaining 39 times are in a negative context and carry negative moral implications. Leviticus gives a long list commanding against the illicit and uncovering of erva. Any discovery of erva is grounds for divorce, and Yahweh will turn away from the people of Israel if he sees erva in their camp. From this, it is clear that the text has made use of a morally neutral rather than negative term for nakedness, this is arum, in the Garden of Eden account. This contrasts with Wallace's findings. Upon closer inspection of his analysis, it soon becomes clear that Wallace conflated the usage of arum and erva, looking only at the concept of nakedness in the Hebrew Bible rather than the specific Hebrew words. Of the 12 verses that Wallace cites, 9 contain the root for erva, and 1 verse does not contain any word at all in Hebrew meaning naked. Rather, it has the word to cover, thus implying a pre-existent state of nakedness. Of the 2 remaining citations, both occur after the prophet has denounced the erva and harlotry of Jerusalem, and are part of the prophecy that if Jerusalem does not repent, then destruction and arum will be the consequences. These consequences themselves are not judged to be morally negative, although they may be undesirable. Therefore, Wallace's claim that Arum in Genesis 2 and 3 has a connection to other negative usages of naked in the Hebrew Bible is unsupported. Now, in the Quran, the root sin waw aleph, sawa'at, occurs 165 times in the Quran. Not including the 5 references in the Garden of Eden account, 153 occurrences in the Quran, an overwhelming majority are in a morally negative connotation and refer to immoral, evil, and sinful behavior. The remaining 7 occurrences are in negative contexts, but are not morally negative. They refer to distress caused by people, events, or information, and represent every single iteration of the imperfect active and perfect passive forms of the verb. Thus, the morally neutral usages of the root sin waw aleph occur in specific situations only, solely in the imperfect active and perfect passive forms of the verb. Thus, Nasser's comment on the inherently sinful nature of exposing nakedness agrees with the usage of the root sin waw aleph in the Quran. There is one other word for naked in the Quran, coming from the root ayin ta ya. It appears 3 times in the Quran, twice in reference to an open or naked seashore, and once in Surah 20, verse 118, also in reference to Adam and Eve. There is therein, in Eden, enough provision for thee not to go hungry, nor to go tara, nor to go naked. None of these commentaries referenced have any discussion on this root. However, this second root only has a neutral function. It is not a desirable situation to be tara, but there is nothing inherently immoral about it. In fact, it occurs in a similar setting to Arum in the Hebrew Bible, in the context of being poor, hungry, and without enough covering to protect from the elements. It is fascinating to see that the Quran makes a clear choice in assigning moral implications to Adam and Eve's nakedness in the garden. It is also intriguing that this choice contrasts that of the Hebrew Bible and changes the usage of nakedness in the Garden of Eden from a morally neutral word to a morally negative one, even though in each case another option was available. What is more, when used in regard to human reference, there are clear parallels in the usage of the morally negative words erva and sin waw aleph sawa'at, as well as parallels in the usage of the morally neutral words arum and tara, since they appear in comparable contexts. This comparison opens doors for further research. Modern scholarship has not grasped the philological distinction between negative and neutral nakedness in the Hebrew Bible. It was lost somewhere in the centuries. What remains to be discovered is when and how the distinction passed out of common knowledge, since it was possibly missing by the time of the writing of the Quran. Muhammad either didn't have the story written down in front of him, or else the people telling him the story didn't know the difference. Or perhaps his representation grew out of the then current cultural view of the text. Alternatively, perhaps the author of the Quran made a conscious choice to reverse the understanding of nakedness in the Hebrew Bible. Answers could lie in the conceptualization and usage of sawa'at and tara in pre-Islamic and early Islamic poetry. In addition, examining the usage of arum and erva in Mishnaic writings that predate the rise of Islam could give an idea of whether the perception of these words changed prior to the time of Muhammad. Furthermore, it may be possible that the negative connotation of nakedness was borrowing from Christianity, which had completely separated from Jewish and Hebrew writings by the 7th century CE. What comparing these 2 terms teaches is that scholarship today is missing all of these distinctions, both historical and philological. Moreover, this research highlights areas that non-comparative scholars could address. For Hebrew Bible scholars, it would be beneficial to study the repercussions of neutral nakedness on readings of the garden text, which appears among the foundational chapters of the Hebrew Bible. How does this philological understanding change readings of arum and erva, both in the garden account as well as later on in the Hebrew Bible? Such a distinction would certainly have changed Wallace's analysis of nakedness, in which he conflated the 2 terms and drew conclusions on Adam and Eve's nakedness from the usage of both arum and erva, even though erva never occurs in the Eden narrative. How does the idea of covering play into the usage of both terms? And with regards to the Quran, an examination of the concept of morally negative nakedness in connection with modesty rules could open a conversation about how the ideology of modesty is reflected in Muslim practice. Does the negative connotation translate over to the conceptualization of covering? How does that change the perception of the covering of bodies and the covering of sin through forgiveness? These questions remain outside the purview of this study, but they give an idea of what is missing in the comparative field. Indeed, perhaps just as important as the comparison of the two texts are the conclusions one can draw on the value of the comparative method itself. Comparing the biblical and Quranic notions of nakedness in the garden demands scholars to pay more attention to the nuances of the text in both traditions. In conclusion, the comparative study of nakedness in the Hebrew Bible and the Quran leads to two key conclusions. Firstly, it provides new philological analysis of the texts, illustrating significantly different approaches to nakedness within the texts of the Hebrew Bible and the Quran. The Hebrew Bible uses a morally neutral word to describe nakedness, while the Quran uses a morally negative word. Moreover, the philological comparative approach highlights nuances in word usage, of which scholarship today appears to be largely unaware. Secondly, the comparative study opens doors to areas requiring further comparative and non-comparative study in the Hebrew Bible and the Quran. Such a proliferation of ideas demonstrates the value of the comparative method. Furthermore, as this proliferation also stems from the philological approach to studying the texts, it bears witness to the worth of a deep philological approach, as understanding of language precedes interpretation. Addressing the questions stemming from this study regarding the concept of nakedness in the Garden of Eden could have significant repercussions in scholarship. Views of nakedness function as elements in the formation of social relations, marital relations, cultural modesty norms, atonement theologies, and historical perception of gender roles, to name a few. Therefore, the further study of nakedness bears relevance in theology, history, text analysis, and social, gender, and religious studies. As demonstrated, a comparative approach to these efforts will greatly enrich scholarship as a whole. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Rebekah, for that paper. And let me now turn it over to Dr. Carly Krautz to engage with you for a little bit. Please.
Thank you, Rebekah. I enjoyed your paper. I wondered if we might start with, why do you think that these languages have multiple terms for nakedness at all? Why does Hebrew need two terms? Is it specifically to make this distinction, do you think, or do you think it stems from other concerns?
I would think that it's a reflection on their culture and their context. For example, to use a very oft quoted example, when you go up into the Inuit, the First Nations up in Canada and Alaska, and they have many words for different types of snow because it's required based on their context. That it's important to know, is the snow light and fluffy, or is it more wet and mushy? Whereas in most English speaking countries, we've never needed that. We have maybe snow, sleet, and hail, but we don't have much more distinction than that because we haven't required it. And so I think that this is having multiple words for nakedness is a reflection on their culture and their context, and that there were distinctions that needed to be made by their culture. And I think we're maybe just at the beginning of figuring out what these distinctions are and how that functioned.
Thank you. In fact, you mentioned the multiple words for frozen precipitation. I discovered in English that there is a word for soft hail. Just a couple of weeks ago, we had soft hail here in Southern California.
Wow.
Apparently it's called grapple. But it took a Minnesotan to tell me what that word was. Not a word we usually need around here.
Yeah.
Thank you. So thinking about these terms, about a room. So one of the things that I was thinking about as you were talking is the way that nakedness is often associated with shame, either for the person who is naked or the person who views the nakedness. And I was thinking, for example, of this case where Isaiah walks around Jerusalem, a room, and you've described that as morally neutral. But the prophet is of course, is not receiving judgment, but is conveying judgment. And so I wondered, if you might explore a little bit this possible moral valence of shame and how that might connect into the terminology a room, if you might.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's a really interesting connection with the idea of shame in a room, even tied within the garden account itself, because it says the man and his wife or his woman were naked in front of each other and they were not ashamed. Um, and they only start feeling that shame when they become aware of their nakedness. But there's also, so I'm going to take a slight tangent, there's also a play on words happening in here, because one verse, two verses after it says the man and woman were not ashamed, even though they were a room in front of each other, it says the serpent was the most a room of all the creatures that God had created. And a room, in this sense, gets translated as cunning or smart, clever. Uh, Nevertheless, there is a play on words going here. The serpent is more naked, and so there's this connection between nakedness and awareness and shame. And when we're aware of our nakedness, and which I think can also be looked at as vulnerability, when we're aware of that vulnerability, very often it can lead to shame and the desire to cover this shame. And I think that theologically, the text is making some really interesting statements when it says the man and woman try to cover their own shame. They make girdles for themselves out of fig leaves. But then the deity comes and makes coverings for them before sending them out of the garden, before expelling them. And so I do think there is this very close connection. And I love how you've turned this to Isaiah, who is walking around naked, like to his shame, you could say, a very shameful state of being, just walking around naked everywhere. But using that to point the finger of judgment to other people's state of shamefulness, really. But that they've covered up that shame so that it's almost that they're pretending like it's not there in a way. So I think there's a ton of places we could go with this. I am interested in writing a paper on the intersection of shame with nakedness and shame also with awareness and cunning with the wordplay in a room. I have not written it yet though, but it's on my docket for future writing. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. Thank you. Perhaps a paper for next year's regional when one hopes that we will be able to be in person again. I would be absolutely fascinated. By the way, I think we're running short on time here, but I'd be absolutely fascinated to find out what some of the Jewish commentators, particularly in contemporaries with Al-Tabari, some colleagues, a former colleague of mine in Nottingham, Holger Zelentine, has done some really fascinating work on the relationship amongst Jewish and Christian Muslim interpretations around that time. So I'd be absolutely fascinated to see what the Jewish interpreters are doing around that time as well, and whether there might be some conversations happening there. But thank you for a really interesting paper.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Rebekah, and thank you, Carly, and thanks to all of you for tuning in for this installment, and we hope you'll continue to do so. And indeed, we all hope maybe the next regional meeting will be a little bit closer to normal. But until then, take good care, everyone.